Death of a loved one is a painful experience for everyone who experiences it. When our mother, father, or one of our grandparents passes away, it's a particularly difficult time for us. A shoulder to cry on and someone to lean on during these difficult times can be extremely comforting in these situations. We're forced to mourn alone, which is the most difficult aspect of the situation. During today's episode, we'll share with you a rather tragic story that took place deep in the Russian far north. A teenage girl has spent her entire life living with her grandmother. Rather than reaching out to her relatives and neighbors for assistance when the elderly woman died and the young girl was left alone, they decided to take advantage of her plight in a cruel and inhumane manner. Svetlana was a teenage girl who lived with her grandmother in a remote village in the Russian countryside. Why was it her grandmother who raised her, and why was she adopted? Because her parents had been deceased for a long period of time. After her mother died in the hospital while giving birth to the girl, Svetlana's father entered a state of tango and committed suicide when she was only 3 years old. He was unable to bear the responsibility of being a single father. Svetlana was taken into the care of her grandmother when she was a small child, and she's been raised by her grandmother ever since. It was only after she'd moved from her father's home in the city to her grandmother's home in the countryside that she was finally taken care of. Svetlana treated her grandmother, Anna, as if she were her biological mother, which was entirely appropriate. She was raised by a woman who did the best she could. Every Sunday, the woman gathered for church as a group. Grandmother Anna tried her best to raise her granddaughter in the spirit of Christian piety, but she failed miserably. Svetlana grew up in a comfortable and prosperous environment. Unfortunately, some of the residents of the village where she lived had a serious issue with the girl and her grandmother, which made matters much worse. The neighbors asserted that this child is nothing more than a newcomer who will only bring misfortune to their community. The people who lived there were believers in a variety of superstitions. Supposedly, a local fortune teller who was giving wishes to willing clients told one of them that Svetlana was to be the cause of all possible fertility in the plans, as well as various illnesses that were to afflict the villagers, according to a rumor. It goes without saying that no one in their right mind would believe such nonsense. However, this fortune-telling spread throughout the town fairly quickly, and for some reason it was quite firmly etched in the minds of the residents by the very superstitious that had spread throughout the town. Svetlana and her grandmother Anna were both considered to be black sheep in their village. Despite the fact that the girl had numerous friends at school, none of her parents permitted them to pay her a visit. Perhaps there was another factor contributing to the dislike the neighbors had for Svetlana and her grandmother. The elderly woman was well off and possessed extensive land holdings. She raised a variety of vegetables and made a substantial amount of money from them. And despite the fact that she never made a big deal out of it and lived a very modest life, word got out that she was hiding a substantial fortune somewhere in her home, which she never acknowledged. The neighbors were most likely jealous, and it was probably out of this jealousy that they harassed the woman and her granddaughter for so long. When Svetlana was 16 years old, she stepped in to take over the majority of the old woman's responsibilities. Her grandmother was not feeling well and was losing more and more strength with each passing week. Given that she'd grown up on a farm since she was a child, Svetlana was well versed in how to properly prepare animals for slaughter and what her daily responsibilities on the farm were. She was also well aware that should her grandmother pass away, she would inherit the entire farm, house, and land that had belonged to her grandmother. However, she had no idea that this day would arrive so quickly. There was a terrible event that occurred one day. Svetlana was preparing a delicious breakfast for her grandmother just like she did every day. The elderly lady enjoyed their morning discussions over steaming mugs of hot tea. Unfortunately, Grandma was unable to attend the meal on that particular day. As she was waiting for her grandmother, Svetlana waited for several dozen minutes without receiving an answer. The young lady made the decision to enter the old woman's room. She was, however, unprepared for what she encountered there. Gran's body was partially wrapped in bedclothes on the floor beneath the grandmother's feet. She had not left, and she was completely devoid of color. Her departure was most likely caused by a stroke, which occurred during the night, according to the evidence. The elderly woman appeared to have wanted to get out of bed at that point and call for assistance, but was unable to do so. Svetlana was completely at a loss for what to do. She tucked the elderly woman back into bed and began to pray over her, repeating the rosary over and over. She went to the parish priest to inform him of the terrible tragedy that occurred. In response, the priest informed her that he was currently finishing up renovations at the church and that he would be able to conduct the funeral ceremony in 3 days at the earliest. He also mentioned that it was said in a pleasant manner. In fact, her grandmother was still lying in her home at the time of the incident. It was intended to be a token of respect for the deceased. The young lady accepted the current state of affairs and immediately returned home. She had not anticipated that they would come face to face with something unpleasant on the spot. Svetlana noticed a small group of people who had gathered in front of her house and decided to investigate. The majority of them were elderly women who happened to be neighbors of the grandmother Anna. Astonishingly, some of them didn't say anything and instead went inside the house and walked around as if they were looking for something. Svetlana was shocked. The young lady approached the entire group and inquired as to what was going on. She was completely unprepared for what she was about to hear. "What were you doing here in the first place?" one of the women inquired. "We were informed that your grandmother had passed away." The girl attempted to explain that the house was still my grandmother's, but she was still lying there, and that she hadn't even been buried yet. She also stated that Grandma had promised her the farm, which she was to take over after her death. After further investigation, it was discovered that the grandmother had made an error in her will, and that Svetlana was therefore not entitled to anything. Svetlana was pushed over the fence by a group of women who had come out of the crowd and grabbed her by the hair. They shouted what she was looking for as she fell to the ground crying. Not only that day, but she had been pushed over the fence several times before. The village leader had to have been involved in this scheme somehow as well. Svetlana sobbed and stood by as the neighbors searched through the house, room by room, for the old woman's valuables and money. They were obviously frustrated because they were unable to locate anything. Svetlana returned to the church, hoping to pray not only for her grandmother's soul, but also for herself. She spent the next 2 hours on her knees, imploring God for assistance. Someone had called the church looking for Svetlana, and when the girl answered the phone, she discovered that it was a bank representative who had called to inquire about her whereabouts. The man told her something that completely threw her off her feet. It turned out that her grandmother, Anna, had, just before her death, transferred all of her money into an account that belonged to Svetlana. What's more, the old woman had sold her farm to a businessman from the city who had plans to open an agro-tourism operation in the area, and the money from this transaction was also in the account. However, you should be aware that from that point on, she did not have to be concerned about money until the end of her life. It appeared that Svetlana's grandmother was well aware that her neighbors would make her grandmother's life miserable after her death, and she decided to protect her granddaughter in this manner for the future. After the funeral, Svetlana decided to move to the city and attend university. She purchased a large apartment in the center and began a wonderful new life. As for her nasty neighbors, they were not too pleased with the whole situation. Each of the women who had their hair in their eyes needed to compensate him for the property that had been destroyed during the apartment construction. With that and everything else for today, I'd like to know what you think of this story. If you liked it, please forward it to your friends and family. In the meantime, stay warm, and I'll see you in the next episode.